Hello everyone, this is Robin Warder, and welcome to a special bonus episode of The Trail Went Cold. You might remember that back in January, we released an episode where we conducted an interview with Scott Reeder, a longtime journalist who put together a true crime podcast called Suspect Convictions, which covered the 1990 murder of a 9-year-old girl named Jennifer Lewis and the controversial conviction of a suspect named Stanley Liggins. Well, season 1 of the podcast has concluded and was a big success, so Suspect Convictions has just returned for Season 2 and will be featuring a different case about another controversial murder conviction. Scott contacted us and asked if we would like to interview him again about this new season, so we happily brought him back to talk about it. Have a listen. Okay, I'm here with Scott Reeder, the host of the Suspect Convictions podcast. We had him on here several months ago to talk about the release of Suspect Convictions Season 1, and here we are many months later, and they've released Suspect Convictions Season 2 has just started. The episode number 1 launched just a couple days before we're recording this, so before we talk about Season 2, Scott, maybe you'd like to give us just a quick recap of your background as a journalist and how Suspect Convictions Season 1 came about.
Well, I've been a journalist for about 30 years. I've worked for newspapers and news services during that period of time. And, about a year and a half ago, I decided, I want to try something of my own. And I was wanting to write a book about a murder case I covered as a young reporter. It was a horrible case involving a 9-year-old girl that had been kidnapped, strangled, sexually assaulted, and then taken to a school playground and set on fire. They arrested an African-American man several days later. I was always kind of skeptical of the evidence they had against this guy. I had no problem believing he was a bad man. I just had a problem believing that they had sufficient evidence to charge him in this crime. And I investigated this case, found that the key witness against him had been a undercover police informant in 83 other cases, and she just happened to be the person that looked out her window and saw taillights that she said she'd recognize anywhere. Well, of course, the fact that she'd been an undercover police informant had never been disclosed to the defense, yet alone to the jury. That was problematic. There were some documents that were not turned over to the defense, or at least a appellate court found that they hadn't been turned over to the defense. But there also was a cellmate that was with the guy who had said that he had confessed to the crime. I hunted down the cellmate, who was a career criminal, and he said, well, the reason I testified is because the police said if I didn't, they were going to charge me as accessory to murder. And, of course, the police couldn't have charged him with accessory to murder, but he contends that they threatened him with that, and that's why he testified. We also found there was a recent immigrant from South Africa who expressed white supremacist views that was on the jury. Not only was he allowed on the jury, but his wife was put on the jury with him. So we found a lot of real anomalies in that first season as we investigated the case. He's going to have a new trial this spring, probably. Sometime next year. I'm guessing this spring. We haven't set a trial date yet. And it'll be interesting to see how that case shakes out.
Yes, before we move on to Season 2, I was just curious about what your plans were to close off Season 1, because I know you were hoping that the trial would be the end of Season 1, but it got delayed till 2018, so are you planning to do maybe...
Well, we closed out Season 1 saying there's going to be a trial, and we're going to return to, when there is a trial, we're going to return to it, cover the trial gavel to gavel every day for 2 to 3 weeks, and turn episodes each day. That's the plan right now.
So maybe you'd like to give us an outline of the case you're planning to feature on Suspect Conviction Season 2.
Well, we just launched this week. It's an exciting case. Here's the story. About 20 years ago, a man by the name of Barton McNeil. He's a single dad. He has a 3-year-old daughter. He had visitation rights to his daughter. She spent a lot of time at his home. He was dating a woman who, for about 3 years, who had a history of violence. In fact, there have been some domestic abuse charges filed against her. So she had a bit of a history of violence. The relationship was very tumultuous. At the end, they went to a restaurant in Bloomington, Illinois, and they had a heated argument, and he broke off the relationship with her. And that night, she repeatedly called his home and just tried to get things back together, and he said, "I don't want to get back together with you." And the last call he got was at 10:30, and she said, "Is your daughter going to be staying with you tonight?" And he said, "Yes, Christina's staying with me." The next morning, he wakes up, he goes into the bedroom, and he finds his daughter laying in the bed, face down. And he shakes her to wake her up, and she's dead. He goes into a panic. He dials 911. Police, paramedics, firefighters, the coroner's office, they all pour into that room, and they find that she's died of natural causes. That's their preliminary finding. Later that day, Bart comes back to his house, goes in the bedroom, and he looks at the screens on the window in this first floor apartment, and he sees that they've been cut right above the levers, where they hold the screen into the window. Like, so if somebody could reach in these holes above the levers, they could open the window from the inside, and it's the screen. And at this point, he thinks there's been a break-in to this house. So he starts frantically calling into 911, calls three times in a row. Get somebody out here. There's my daughter has been murdered. She did not die of natural causes. She's been murdered. Get somebody out here right now. And the police take a kind of a lackadaisical approach to it. They go, "No, it's natural causes." "No, she's been murdered." We have all this on tape. And at one point, the lieutenant says in exasperation to the dispatcher, "What the hell is his problem?" And it's like, his daughter died this morning? Wouldn't that be something that would upset you? I mean, that'd be my reaction to it. But he, so this case was, is a pretty horrific case. Finally, he hounds them enough that he got them to send a detective out that night. And he shows them where the screen's been cut. And he says, "What I think happened is my ex-girlfriend, Masuk Nolan, broke into this house, suffocated my daughter, and left." And so anyway, that was the theory he gave them that night. The next morning, they do the autopsy on the daughter, and they find that she's been suffocated. So the police arrest him for murder, saying, well, how else would he have known that she'd been suffocated unless he did it? So the case goes to trial, and it got he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. They wanted to present an alternate suspect in the trial, pointing towards this girlfriend, but the judge wouldn't allow any of that testimony or evidence to be entered in, saying he thought that was insufficient evidence. So it was a difficult case all the way around. I mean, so he ends up going to the Menard Correctional Center, which is like a prison that was built in the 1850s. I mean, it's an ancient prison here in Illinois. It makes Shawshank prison seem like a day spa. I mean, it's not a good place at all to be at. So 12 years later, his girlfriend's remarried. Her husband tells her he's going to file for divorce. And this is how she responds. Her husband's a Chinese American. His mother is Chinese. She goes to a Chinese restaurant, has a waitress pose as on a phone call, pose as a college student needing a ride to Chicago, and call up her mother-in-law and tells her she'll pay her $500 if she gives her a ride to O'Hare Airport. And the mother-in-law says, okay. And they meet in a grocery store parking lot. And Masuk attacks her with a hammer. And at least we assume it's a hammer, a heavy object of some sort. Knocks her out. Drags her into a sewing shop that Masuk owned. And apparently she's still not dead, so she strangles her. Then she goes and gets goes to Menards and gets one of those big plastic storage tubs, and she breaks her back, or makes her mother-in-law's back, putting her into the storage tub and locking her up. And then she drives to O'Hare in her mother-in-law's car, drives to Midway Airport in her mother-in-law's car, leaves the car there, takes a bus back to Bloomington, calls up a friend from church, and it says she has a heavy container that needs to have. She needs help lifting it into the SUV, and it's full of china, she says. And she comes over, lifts it up into the SUV, and she takes her 6-year-old son and drives 90 miles away and buries her in a park. And she probably would have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for this woman turns up missing, and the restaurant worker sees that this woman's missing, and it's the woman that she'd called on the phone. And she says, oh my gosh, I must have been tricked into doing this. So she contacts the police, and the police unravel the case, and the woman is put on trial and sentenced to 55 years in prison. And so the question that we have is, okay, she was the alternate suspect that nobody was allowed to present at the first trial, and she has propensity to, somebody hurts her, to respond by killing the person that person loves the most, as in this guy's, her husband's mother. Question is, did she do the same thing in her husband's when her boyfriend broke up with her by killing his daughter? And that's what we're investigating for this season 2.
And what compelled you to select this particular case? I've heard the first episode of this season, and I know you were particularly taken aback when you listened to the 911 call from Barton McNeil, and what compelling audio it was, because he sounded genuinely distraught.
You know what? I didn't listen to the 911 tape until about a week ago, actually, just right before we recorded season 1. I read the transcripts of it, and quite frankly, the transcripts of the 911 tape weren't all that compelling. I mean, just like, was this guy just going through the motions? You just couldn't really tell. And I picked the case because after interviewing a number of attorneys about different cases that are out there and cases that were worthy of examination, and this case had the particulars were just fascinating to me. The alternate suspect turns out to be a murderer. How can this be? Why isn't this case being looked at again? I mean, there's just a lot of things that were found fascinating about it. So we picked this case because I thought the facts of it were really interesting. And I was explaining that the audio that as we investigated, the audio was just very compelling. Listening to the father argue with the police, desperately try to get a homicide detective out there. Now, mind you, if you just killed your daughter and they thought it was natural causes, would you be calling the police and saying, get a homicide detective out here? She's been murdered. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, so that was one of the things that we found compelling. But if you'd like to listen to the audio, you can go to suspectconvictions.com, and there's links there to iTunes and other places where you can download the episode. I'd really recommend subscribing because this is going to be probably a 12, 14 episode series. I think we're going to look at a lot of fascinating details in this case. The more I dig, the more shocked I am by what things turn up.
Yeah, one thing I wondered is the challenges of doing a new case this season that you had never tackled before, because season 1 you did a case that you had been involved with since day one all those years ago, but this one you were going in fresh. So how much different was it than season 1? How much more of a challenge was it?
Well, it's different, that's for sure. But, of course, I've been a journalist for an awfully long time. So most stories you go into, you're not necessarily real emotionally involved in. There's a little bit of attachment. Obviously, with season 1, I was very emotionally involved in that case because, I was the person that found the body that night, or one of the people that found the body that night. With season 2, and I just picked that case because I was so involved with it, and I was always very, I should say, suspicious about the circumstances of the trial and the arrest and some other things. With this case, I reviewed a bunch of cases, and I just found the facts of this case to be very interesting.
And one thing I wondered, you might reveal this as the season goes along, but was there anything in the background of Bart McNeil like to suggest he had a motive or he was capable of this violence? Because I know with Stanley Liggins from season 1, he already had an extensive criminal history, but did Bart McNeil's murder just kind of come out of nowhere, people thought?
He had never been arrested for any crime. He'd never been convicted of anything. He'd never had any brushes with the law that we know of. He was an assistant manager at a Red Lobster. He, obviously wasn't making a lot of money, but he seemed to be, somebody who was doing his job and doing okay. No history of violence. So, no, there wasn't really anything in his background that would point to him doing this. As far as a motive, the police contended that his motive might have been that he was sexually assaulting her, and that he killed her to cover up the sexual assault. But first of all, there's conflicting forensic opinions on whether this 3-year-old had been sexually assaulted. I mean, forgive me for getting into a little too much graphic here, but her rectum was swollen during the autopsy. The pathologist said he believed that, or said the pathologist said she believed that was a result of her being sexually assaulted. But other pathologists have looked at this information and looked at the reports and the photos and said, no, that's part of the death process. As the body goes through rigor mortis, the anus tends to expand, and no, this is a finding that science has kind of cataloged over the last 20 years since the original case. So there's some question on whether she was sexually assaulted or not, but one of the things that Bart pointed to is, okay, even if Christina had been sexually assaulted by somebody, he says it wasn't me, but he also says, in fact, he accused Masuk, his girlfriend, of sexually assaulting Christina with a vibrator at the police headquarters when they're doing an interrogation. I mean, the police put them both in the same room to see what would shake loose, and he made that allegation. Now, he said he doesn't know for sure that it happened, other than he said his girlfriend indeed had vibrators, but he said that the police put him and his girlfriend in the same room with to see kind of what would shake out, and he made this allegation saying, hey, they said she'd been sexually assaulted. He said, I knew I didn't sexually assault her or kill her. I assumed the person who killed her did it, and I knew that my girlfriend had these vibrators, so I accused her of sexually assaulting her. He said it very well may have happened that way. Maybe it was somebody she knew. He doesn't know how this child was sexually assaulted, if she was sexual, or even whether she was sexually assaulted at all. One of the things worth noting is in the pathology report, it found that the child's hymen was still intact. So, and there was no semen recovered from the scene. So we don't know what she was sexually assaulted with, whether she was actually sexually assaulted, or who would have done it. I mean, there's just not a lot of evidence pointing one way or the other as to who could have done this. And one of the things we're going to investigate is this the kind of thing that a female suspect would likely have done. I don't know. So those are some things we're going to be investigating in the upcoming season.
I wanted to ask about Ma-Suk Wang. I actually just discovered the other day that very recently she was featured on the Oxygen true crime show Snapped. It profiled the story of when she murdered her mother-in-law, but I haven't seen it, but apparently they didn't mention anything at all about this case. It just focused on that one. So she's already become kind of infamous even without this podcast. Did you get a chance to interview her at all?
I've tried to. I've written her letters in prison asking for an interview. She hasn't responded. But I'd very much like to interview her. I think it would be great if we could get her point of view to be presented. We're obviously presenting, what she said in trial and some other things about the case. We're trying our very best to be balanced about it and approach it like you'd expect to investigators to be investigating it, being very fair and weighing the evidence, talking to both sides in the case, and then trying to reach some sort of conclusion. And a lot of times, when I'm working on this, I'll one day say, well, yeah, this is really compelling. I think it kind of points towards acquittal. The next day I'll be looking at something and go, no, this is not looking good for Bart. And you just kind of weigh it back and forth, and you try to be as fair as you possibly can and just present those doubts and those opinions to the listeners as you go along.
So you said that you're planning about 12 to 14 episodes, and at this point we've only released episode 1. So I guess just tell us what else you have planned for this season, like what your future episodes are going to be focusing on. Is there still more investigative work you need to do to prepare future episodes?
Absolutely. I mean, in a lot of ways we're approaching it very much like they approach Serial. We are taking a look at one case and going at it in depth. And we're leading our listeners through the investigation as we do it. They're going to be listening to it real time. We have lots of interviews set up. We're asking questions. We're going to give listeners an opportunity to present questions that they'd like to have asked of the prisoner, Barton McNeil, while he's in prison. Ask him some questions, that they may have things come up in their minds that we've never considered asking. When I talk to Bart once or twice a week on the phone, and we can pose some of those questions to him. We're trying very hard to include the listeners in this. We're going to have our second episode, which drops next Monday, looks at the window evidence and a whole bunch of evidence there. Could there have been a break-in or couldn't there? I won't get into all the details, but we have the prosecutor present her point of view on why this couldn't have happened. Somebody couldn't have intruded through the window. And then we look at evidence from not only from the defense, but from, the National Weather Service and a whole lot of other groups that have varying points of view on this, and presenting those, and we just kind of discuss it back and forth. My co-host on this show is a fellow by the name of Willis Kern, who is also a veteran journalist for public radio in Bloomington, Illinois, and so we talk back and forth and just kind of discuss our concerns and go that way. our third episode, we're going to look at the allegations of sexual assault. And we're going to talk to some experts in the field. We're going to look at the autopsy reports. We're going to look at a variety of things and try to weigh it out. Was there likely a sexual assault here? If there was, is it likely that Barton committed this, or that Masuk did this? Or we don't really know right now, but this is a discovery path that we're going down, and we're going to take the listeners along with us, and they're going to have a chance to kind of hear what they're thinking is this on this as well. So that's kind of where we're at right now. As far as that's the third episode. We're going to then do an in-depth dive into Masuk's life, looking at who she was. She was an immigrant from Korea, things that happened in her life that are curious, how she ended up hooking up with Bart. Then we're going to do the same thing with Bart. I mean, and this is a relationship that began as an illicit affair between two married people, and evolved into this. So there's a lot of twists and turns with that as well. We're going to bring in people who deal with these type of cases routinely and get their opinions. We're going to do some roundtable discussions. I hope you guys can join us on one of those roundtables, and we can kind of discuss the findings we have as we go through this case. Would that be something you guys would be interested in doing?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, because I've been reading up on this case last week since I heard the first episode. Like, I went to the free Bart McNeil website, and it's just a very compelling case, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing the rest of the season and possibly joining you on a panel.
Yeah, I'd love to. And if you guys would like to hear these guys on a panel, or you just like to listen to the season, go to suspectconvictions.com, and there'll be some links there you can go to, or you just go to iTunes or Stitcher and do a search for Suspect Convictions and subscribe. I really would recommend subscribing, because that gives you an opportunity to it's free, but it gives you an opportunity to continually get the downloads each week and keep up with what's going on. So anyway, any other questions, guys?
I think that's about it. So thank you very much for joining us. And like Scott said, if any of you listeners would like to see us on a panel, be sure to let them know. Anything else you want to plug, Scott, about the podcast, or have you pretty much covered everything?
Well, like I said, I always like to repeat where you can get the podcast. It's doing extremely well already for this season in the ratings. But go to suspectconvictions.com and please subscribe to it. I think you're going to be fascinated by what we find out this year.
Yes, definitely. I'm very excited for it already myself. So thank you very much for joining us, Scott.